One thing that I discovered, and you can see this. Look what happens when I wait. Watch this.
Oh, that's a little bonus. That's a little bonus for the video
Yeah, there
viewers.
is no video.
Yeah.
When I was bringing my laptop to my face earlier, it looked like something out of Vertigo. You know, like when you rack focus the camera, like that woo woo thing that camera people do when like you see something shocking. There was some weird stuff going on with my computer camera. That's all I'm saying. It looked
Nothing
cool.
works
It looked
better on a
dynamic.
podcast than visual humor.
Yeah,
Thank you.
talking about what no one can see.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Welcome to the Voyage Podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
So, Jacob and I are bound to talk with you guys this time about rings, religion, and idols.
That was so clever.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh, I see what you did there. Bound and determined.
Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Voyage Podcast, where, like I said, Jacob and I, we're going to be talking about religion, rings, and idols, but specifically their binding power, the role that they always play in mythology, whether that's secular or sacred mythology, and then also the role that they play in it's exclusively Christian theology. And it's not always necessarily the negative connotation you might be expecting. And so that's what this one's going to mostly be about. We're going to be talking about what we're finally going to talk about. That
I want to dedicate this. Let me look it up here. What was that on Apple? I want to dedicate this to friend of the show, SKP Machine.
Oh, gosh.
Who left us a lovely 1-star review from our very first episode way back on January 9, where he said, Lord of the Rings all the way down. I don't need another podcast that uses those books as a touchstone for every other literary work. Well, this is for you, SKP, where we finally
a Lord of the Rings, not even
how many episodes in,
and it's not even really a Lord of the Rings episode. I just want to clarify.
About all kinds of stuff.
There's rings were there long before the Tolkien epic. Now that's not to denigrate, obviously, that the Lord of the Rings stories, but that didn't come up out of nowhere. So we're going to be talking about the role of rings in not just mythology, but like I said, in theology, and how they, where that idea, the idea of binding, right? One ring to bind them, or in the darkness bind them. That didn't just pop up out of nowhere either. And so that's really what the big focus of this one's going to be about. But it's what are you being bound to? So that was obviously the big worry in the Lord of the Rings. But like I said, it's not just the ancient myths. In the contemporary myths, like Lord of the Rings, but also Harry Potter, this idea of binding yourself to something has always had this very kind of powerful, not just storytelling value, but theological and, what would you want to say, like psychological in the classical sense of the term, where it binds your soul, right? It's always had that psychological value to it.
This should be a pretty fun episode. I actually look forward to this a lot. For one, I actually kind of perused your outline out of sheer curiosity this time. I did. Do you know that Green Lantern's one of my favorite comic heroes?
You're just all about the DC.
So,
yeah.
I am. No, I'm more of a DC fanboy than a Marvel fanboy.
So first,
totally true.
We have to get through, since we're not doing minisodes anymore, we got to talk about the word religio, which is where we get the word religion, means to bind.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that's true.
The idea of...
I learned that. So I was doing things trying to lay out stuff for my kids, actually, hilariously over their heads. One of the things about being a father is you learn you learn
some of us faster
the
than
hard
others.
way. Yeah, well, I'll admit that one too. Man, I was trying to give like college level lectures to my kids when they were like 9, and it's like that was probably a mistake. But Anyway, one of the things that we talked about for me personally is discovering that religio meant to bind,
Mhm.
right? Like a cord that binds wood together.
Mhm.
Um, and
Or a
also at the
cord
time
that
when I
binds
was,
people together.
you
Yeah,
know,
we'll get there.
whoa,
Yep, little
whoa.
teaser.
Um, back when they were using that term religio, back when it was first being used, and I think this is like in late Renaissance. I don't think it's, well, it had to have been earlier than that, I
I
suppose.
mean,
It's
it's
not like Latin
Latin.
didn't have
Yeah.
religio. Maybe what I'm thinking of though is when it started being used to refer to something other than just like the actual utilitarian binding something together like a piece of
Like the
rope.
spiritual
Um,
value.
yeah, as a religious word,
Mhm.
right? As a theological concept. They were using that term to describe like heretical sects. They were talking about people outside of Christendom, and they were referring to their religio,
Mm.
the thing that binds those people together.
Sure.
In other words, the defaults, there wasn't a word religion, and this is actually why I was talking to my kids about it. Because in today's context, religion is this word that categorizes like this thing that some people do on Sundays,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And
Well, it's
that
or it's a
default
it's a
reality.
checklist of beliefs, checklist of practices.
Yeah, it's this kind of category of stuff,
Mhm.
right? But ancient people didn't actually have that. That's such a modern use of the term religion, and they didn't have this word religion the way that we have the word religion in the modern context. What they eventually had is they started to use the word religion or religio. They adopted this binding word religio to describe what they called religion, but they weren't referring to themselves as religious.
Mm.
They were referring to these cults basically,
Well,
or heretical sects or whatever, that is like this is what binds them together away from us, like outside of the context of like what's real
Well, and
kind of
even
thing.
and as we've talked about in so many other contexts, so many other episodes, even though what you were distinguishing was here's the secular use of the term versus the quote unquote spiritual or religious term or use of the term religion. In one sense, the further back you go, that distinction starts to kind of dissipate. And so there's this idea of binding that we've come to use for religion, not just because the people were bound together. And that's why, like you said, it's
Mhm.
not that it's necessarily wrong if you were to look at a checklist of beliefs and practices, because those actions unite the people, right? They will know we were Christians by our love, is a very kind of cheesy 70s hymn that is sometimes sung. They'll know we were
Yeah,
Christians
yeah,
by our
sure.
love. So it's like their loving actions or their teachings about love. We're binding them. And so there's a very human element to the idea of to bind or religio. And we
Oh,
actually
and
see
don't even get
it.
me wrong.
Oh, go ahead.
Uh, don't be wrong. Like I use, obviously I use the word religion all the time. I've adopted the word into my vocabulary, just like everybody else has.
Mhm.
Um,
I thought you were
um,
spiritual and not religious.
yeah. Well, that's actually to go back to like some of our Mandalorian episode stuff.
Yeah.
When we one of the things when you say it's just a way of life, right? Or sometimes people would be like, I'm spiritual, not religious, because religion has this negative connotation to some extent. And I just want to point out the irony that it did when it was first started to be used as well. It's just that Christians didn't identify themselves as religious when this was first being adopted as a word to describe what we call religion. They weren't applying it to themselves. As far as they were concerned, they were just living in reality. And nowadays we have this idea that reality is like what's secular, right? What is kind of like baked into
And
everyone's worldview
that's a
now
different sort of
is,
binding as well, right? Binding yourself to, in a sense, the rules of reality. You don't get to untether yourself, right? But sorry, I didn't mean to go.
yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about kind of the modern context, modern perceptions.
Well, I'm just saying that it's ironic that Christians use the word religion to describe outsiders, people outside of like what's normal and real kind of
Mhm.
thing, and they ascribe their Christian teachings to what is normal and real. Only for whatever 800 years later suddenly religion's being applied to Christians by Christians for the record, right?
Yeah.
And there's just an irony there. It's part of how that subtle way in which Christianity has been turned into an extracurricular or into a
Well,
just one thing that binds people amongst many things that bind
but I think
people.
three interesting sort of informal uses of the idea of binding or the term of binding that are in a religious context. So we have, from both of our faith tradition backgrounds, we have the idea of binding and loosing being really important when it's applied to the apostles, right? And
Oh,
so
for
you
sure.
have this religious authority being determined by the term binding. And so, in the same way that you were talking about Christians being bound together by these beliefs or by these practices, they're also bound by this common sense of authority, whether it's the apostles in the first century or the bishop, the successor to the apostles,
Mhm.
or patriarch, excuse me.
Well, and especially, so here's the thing is I don't want to come off like I'm being all curmudgeonly about this because I do think that I am kind of coming off that way. What I really want to add is that now the you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Now it really is a question of what you bind yourself to. Once upon a time
Yeah,
there was just
it's not a
yeah,
question of
yeah.
if,
Once upon a
it's who.
time
Yeah.
there was this consensus of what was true, and then there was all those other people, and they bound themselves to untruths. Now there's no longer a consensus of what's true, and now everyone has to choose what they bind themselves to.
So the other two examples that I want to kind of push through to, because they are really important for our bigger conversation on religio in terms of religion, is where else do you see binding? The title of that scene with Abraham and Isaac is called The Binding
Mhm.
of Isaac. And so binding was something for sacrifices. So what do we have so far? We have binding and loosing when it comes to religious authority or spiritual authority. We have the binding of spiritual sacrifices. And then what do we have for where else do you see binding in a religious and even Christian context? Have you ever heard of the practice of hand fasting in like England, Scotland,
Uh,
kind of like Celtic?
I don't. The only thing that brings to my mind is the idea of like knights back in the day when they were doing their oaths. They would clasp their hands together. That's
Okay.
actually where that you put your two hands together, flat palms together to pray, right? Like
Hmm.
that thing that we all recognize. That comes from this
Yeah.
idea where back when you were being knighted, you would clasp your
Well,
hands together like that, and then they would
I think they actually do that with priestly
do they still do
ordinations
that?
too, if I'm not mistaken. It's been
I'm
a
not
while
sure if
since
that's
I've
what you're
been to one,
talking about, but
but actually, so what I was referring to, so hand fasting is something in marriages, in
oh,
like
okay.
the engagement
Sure,
marriage
sure.
process. The two will first be hand fast before the actual, like it's kind of like when they talk about the marriage of Joseph and Mary in the Bible, how it was like this multi-layered process. It wasn't just like a one day thing.
I'm disappointed
Um,
that hand fasting isn't closer to ham fisting. Like ham fist ham
oh
fist.
boy,
Okay, anyway, I'm not gonna go down any of that route. Yeah,
you're
I
on fire
know.
today.
I tell you what, it's gonna be a grueling
So
episode, folks, let me tell you.
yeah. So we have, like I said, we have binding when it comes to religious authority, we have it when it comes to sacrifices, and we have it in like I said, both of our traditions see matrimony as a sacrament, right? As a mystery of the faith, as a sacrament or a
Mhm,
covenant of the
mhm.
faith, which there again, all of that has to do with binding, right? We've talked about in our scapegoat episode how the sacrifice was binding the people to God or uniting the people to God. And in a marriage, the husband and wife are bound, not just bound together, but united
Mhm,
as
mhm.
one. And you are united to the group, united to the church to the degree that you are in union with or bound to that spiritual authority, right? The bishop, or go
Mhm.
back to the apostles.
Is the ring is
And so,
obviously so this is just an open question. Is the ring, just because cultures were using rings for these types of oath keeping, like, since time memorial? Or is it actually something that was adopted by Christians as a kind of symbol of the hand fasting? We just wear it on our
so
ring
yeah,
finger to remind us of the hand
well,
fasting? Or do you think it probably just pre-existed, right?
so well, even the hand fasting in the Scotland, Ireland,
Yeah,
like
super
that
old.
that preceded
Sure.
Christianity as well. Like that was actually more like pre-Christian kind of pagan. And I think the same thing with the
Mhm.
ring. We weren't going to go into like all necessarily the I guess say anthropological history of the ring. It was going to be more where do we see it show up in stories and like
Oh,
mythology and stuff.
you don't want to
So
just sit
that's
there and go into the
yeah,
anthropology of ring wearing? Doesn't that sound like a way more entertaining
not
episode than
today.
talking
Not
about all the
today.
cool pop culture?
We haven't even gotten to any stories yet, and so you know that thing that tracks when you lose the
Yeah, yeah.
listener. That's that's. I'm sweating right now.
Let's get to something good quick.
So what are some of those stories that I mean, like we've already mentioned, we talked about the Lord of the Rings. We've talked about in Harry Potter. So we talked about the Horcrux, and one of the
I love how
Horcruxes
you keep
is a
calling.
ring,
I
but
noticed this. Wait, I
all
noticed this
7
in
of
your
them.
outline. It's a for one, it's a Horcrux, but you keep calling it a ho. You keep calling it
Oh,
a Hocrux.
did I not
Yeah,
pronounce
there's
the
no.
or
You have it spelled
the first
HOA or
R?
something like that. Uh,
I see
yeah.
that it actually
It's a
gets it.
Horcrux, not a Hocrux. And I just think it's funny that you keep calling it a Hocrux.
Thank you.
But then again, I guess Horcrux still is kind of funny when you think about it. But
After that little speed bump.
um,
I do remember the first time of course I was exposed to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings first, but reading Plato, he comes across this story and I was like, wait, a magic ring that makes somebody invisible? Is
right,
this where
yeah,
it
it's
came from?
impossible to.
And I know that people will talk about how he wasn't actually inspired by that, more so it was the Norse myth of
Mhm.
Sigurd and Fafnir. Did I say
Yes,
those
I
ones right,
approve.
Jacob? And so but what's cool about going back to the ring of Gyges
Mhm.
in Plato's Republic
Gyges,
or Gyges, but
Giggities.
I always want to do the soft G, but it's probably more of a
Yeah.
hard G. The man in the story, in this mythological story, so he finds this ring that makes him invisible, and he goes and does all these like nefarious things and gets away with it because he's invisible. And it's presented to Socrates as is that the only thing holding, society in place is that we can be seen
Well, yeah, no,
for our
this is
crimes. Like that's the only
like
way
the
that
H.G.
justice
Wells
exists.
Invisible Man story. It is very much.
Yeah, which I heard is actually supposed to be the retelling of it. Actually,
Yeah, it's actually, so far as I know, it's very much inspired by the myth of Gyges or Gyges or whatever. And so basically, just think Invisible Man. If you could be invisible,
yeah,
what would you do because you get away with anything? And that's what's being discussed um, in this Plato dialogue. Which one is? I don't remember which dialogue he's talking about this in. But look it up. Read all of it. Read all of Plato. I'm good at that.
yeah. Well, if you just search ring of
There you go.
GYGES, but what's interesting about that story though is that it's presented as is the ring the thing to unbind somebody from societal conventions? And Socrates' response is really interesting and obviously very wise, which is no, it's the ring that binds this person, but now he's not being bound to society's conventions or bound to justice. He's just as much bound to his appetites, to his passions. And so he's still a slave, if you want to use that language, but now he's a slave to a much worse taskmaster, again, according to Socrates
It's kind
and
of
Plato.
interesting. It just occurs to me,
And
so isn't it true that especially in ancient cultures that slaves would have those, like, maybe it was like a nose ring or something like that was a symbol of
yeah,
slavehood? Um,
I thought that was
uh-huh.
part of it too, yeah.
So it is true. It is very much true that rings have almost just everywhere you look always been, oh, I'm attached to something. I am bound by something.
It's a yeah.
Um, That's deep rooted symbolism right there. I
So
mean, just for it to be so universal like that. I guess I haven't really put
oh
that
yeah.
much thought into this prior to this conversation, but
And even if you want to look at it from like the practical perspective, well, our argument isn't that the practical is in is fighting against the speculative. It's more like it flows
for
from it.
sure.
So like so the idea of binding, yeah, there's a practical element to it, but that's why it's been so much a part of the collective unconscious of ancient peoples. Going back to like we've been talking about with Plato, or I mentioned very briefly Sigurd and Fafnir, which is the cursed ring, which actually was. It seems like that would have been influential to C.S. Lewis's use of a dragon and a ring, if you kind of
Yeah,
remember
Don
what that's
Treader.
from too.
Yeah, Eustace. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
So that seems to be the sort of like, when you talk about the dragon sickness, which comes up in
mhm.
The Hobbit as well, but it's that the dragon is so bound by his greed to this treasure that, it obviously just will kill and destroy and devour anything. And in a sense, the treasure starts to devour the
Well,
dragon.
it's so especially when we're talking about Lord of the Rings and things like that, and the idea of the ring. I remember, and I'm pretty sure either just because of my youth or a lack of inquisitiveness, but it felt very arbitrary. I don't mean that as a criticism. I didn't think it was bad that Bilbo found a ring and turned him invisible, and turns out the ring is this kind of like MacGuffin linchpin for the entire duel between good and evil and stuff like that. I didn't have any qualms with
Yeah.
that, but it felt, oh, it could have just been a fork. It could have been anything. Like the idea of him using a ring.
Well, and it could
Well,
have.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess it
Yeah.
could. You're saying it could have, like, maybe it was a magic sword, or maybe it was like a magic hat or something like that. But no, I mean, I think that he's quite intentionally. He's not using a sword or a hat or something like that. He is specifically using a ring because of the deep rooted kind of human history that we have with rings as covenants
Mhm.
tokens, as icons of oaths and binding and things like that. Um, which seems really,
Yeah, I mean,
really
why not,
obvious, but
like you said, some other um and actually, going back to the Sigurd and Fafnir, the ring, so to speak, was cursed, but again, it could have been any other piece of jewelry, any other piece of metal, any other treasure. But that's what, in a sense, brings on that dragon sickness. And it's more like it's representative of the whole, right? It binds one, like I've already said, to the treasure. But jumping ahead, like you've already mentioned, that Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So if you remember in that one, Eustace, who was already like a brat, like throughout the whole story, he comes upon this treasure and he puts it's like a
yeah.
bracelet to him, but it would have been a ring to fit a dragon, but he puts it on his arm. And then when he becomes that dragon, right, it represents that
Well, yes, and
similar
I
sort
mean,
of
like, I don't know
binding.
how familiar you are with like Viking culture and things like that, but those rings, like, they were armbands, right? So on the one
Mm,
hand, I'm sure it was a ring to the dragon, but it would have been, in all likelihood, it would have been native to the size of a human arm to wear on their bicep, right? But then for a dragon,
mm,
it fits his finger or something like that, right? But the idea, so rings, I don't think that C.S. Lewis's use of the ring, or which I'm sure he's referencing Sigurd and Fafnir, especially C.S. Lewis. It's just too it's too whole cloth, kind of
yeah.
thing. But even with
Yeah.
Tolkien, like he
Almost
yeah,
allegorical, right?
almost. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
even with Tolkien, I think that he's it's because the culture, it's because these Germanic cultures and these Nordic cultures that are inspiring so much of Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's what they did, right? And obviously, our wedding rings and things like that are probably in continuity with all this. Um, but so it's like I don't think we feel like rings are arbitrary now because everything's arbitrary now, right? We
Mhm.
don't we don't live symbolic lives consciously any longer. But I think that people back in the day,
Yeah.
even 100 years ago when Tolkien was writing this stuff, or Lewis was writing this stuff, of course they were so,
Of
yeah,
course
like
it's a
it's
ring.
obviously going to be a ring. Like of course that, like, they would never choose anything but a ring in to imbue these stories with these kind of like climactic objects, right? Because the ring is the de
Mhm.
facto, or like a crown even. But even a crown is circular, right? I'm just pointing out that crowns were often,
Well,
you
yeah.
ever wonder why did people wear crowns to begin with? And I think that I'm willing to wager, I'm just kind of guessing here, but it was basically just a ring for your head, like just full stop.
Mhm.
It's still playing into the idea of the ring is the totem that is used to
Well, and yeah, even just where you wear it, right? Wearing it on the head, like you said, is also representative or indicative of being not just functioning head of the community, but in the same way that we talk about Jesus being the head of the church, it shows
Mhm.
a unity, right? And the kingdom would have been the body of the, going back really, really old cultures, it would have been the body of the god, of the
Sure.
pagan god. They would have been, the way that the power of that king or the way the power of that god would have been manifested to the world. And so wearing the crown on the head, like you said, had that double significance besides, you could maybe say, the practical or utilitarian value
Yeah,
too.
no doubt, no doubt.
Speaking of Narnia and C.S. Lewis, so the rings come up. Now, I guess you could say technically it's before Dawn Treader, but it's also in a sense after Dawn Treader. Do you know what I'm
Is
referring
it
to?
Magician's Nephew stuff?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly. So it's before,
yeah.
right? Because it's book one, but it was obviously published after Dawn
Right,
Treader.
yeah.
So
Though so I've only read Magician's Nephew like once. And I don't even remember the story all that well. I did just reread that. I know, right? I need to revisit all
yeah.
the Narnia. Honestly, it's probably been a decade since I read any of them. I remember in Magician's Nephew, isn't there like rings that are like basically portals into like dimensions and things like that?
So that's the thing, is like, this is pre-Narnia in this book,
Uh-huh.
Magician's Nephew. And actually the way that, and this pre-Narnia gets accessed by the main characters, you have this magician, okay, Uncle Andrew, who turns out to very much be an antagonist, an evil villain in the story, but he has these two magic rings, and he doesn't want to test them himself, but he tricks one of the kids into like putting it on or touching it. I can't remember exactly, but like accessing
Mhm.
its power. And what these rings do is they pull you into this other world. Now, this other world that they pull you into
Yeah.
isn't
Yeah,
Narnia
yeah.
yet, but that's what kind of like starts off our big
Okay.
adventure. And so, but what's interesting about these rings as well is, so they get, what happens now? Do they get like buried or something and a tree grows from it and the wood is used to build the wardrobe,
Ooh.
if I'm not
Honestly, it's
mistaken?
been too long since I've read
I
this
think
book,
that's what
man.
it
I
is.
won't be able to I cannot save you.
Yeah.
You're the one that does the outlines,
So
Mike. You're supposed to study this stuff.
yeah. So there again, it's that it's binding you to this other world. And I know this, it's just like, oh, he just needs another excuse to use the word binding, but it's the ring itself that has this magical property. And of course, they don't go into explaining how. It's just, it's a
Mhm.
magician, right? And so, by the way, the magician's nephew is the good guy.
Mhm.
So the
Mhm.
nephew is but
Well,
but
he grows up to
skipping
be
over
the old man. Yeah,
the
professor and
professor in
yeah, that's
Lion,
right.
Witch, and Wardrobe. Um, so, but anyway, you see the same magical and binding quality, because again, it pulls your entire self into this new world that you wouldn't have had access to before. And go back to our original talk about binding in a religious context, is you're bound to this, spiritual world in a way that you did not have access before. And it's not just because you put a ring on. Again, it's not mechanical, it's not utilitarian. It's the idea of the physical ring flowed from the binding, the
Mhm.
religio.
Yeah, I
Does that make
suppose
sense?
so.
Yeah.
Um, is this where are we gonna get Beyonce's song so we can play that throughout like this episode? Like at the
Oh,
better put a ring on it.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, you can pay for that.
It's funny that so even in pop culture, even something like Beyonce, right? Like we still the ring is still something that is we if we have any symbols left in reality, I think the ring is one that's
Mhm.
still pretty uniform. Though I do think it's kind of interesting that even marriage as such is kind of being rejected as a concept because we just refuse to bind
Yeah.
ourselves to anything anymore. And I think like when you think of
Oh, yeah.
binding, like break it down to it's the most like obvious like glue, right? I mean like that we are bound together. We bind together. We have these binding agents, right? In these symbols that we enact, that we wear, that actually means something, right? Like I was having this conversation the other day with somebody about our use of the word symbol as such, where we think like I think that most people use the word symbol now and they say a symbol is it's a metaphor or an allegory or something like that, and that means that it's not real. It's just a symbol is something that
Mhm.
it's something fake that we use to point to something that's true or something like that. I don't think that's the most accurate use of the word symbol. I don't think that's how pre-modern people thought of the idea of symbols. That word symbol in Greek, it means to bring together, right?
It's more real than the thing you hold in your hand. If anything, our literal items are symbolic of a deeper
hmm
reality that is beyond us, right? That transcends
Well,
us.
absolutely. Well, and so the example I gave when I was talking to this person was, like you could say, "Oh, my life is a book," or I'm a novel," or something like that. My story, we use this language about ourselves, right? And most people are going to say, "Oh yeah, but you're not actually a book because you're not actually, you know, a cover with a bunch of pages in between it with words written on it. That's not what you actually are, right?" It's like, yeah, that's true, but you are actually a book. Like you actually do have chapters in your life and you actually are a story and you actually are something that people read. And so it's not that the idea of calling somebody a book is this untrue statement. It's just it's a way of us better understanding what's true about us because there's more than
Well,
one way.
and
There's more than one way to understand
push
reality.
that
Yeah,
even
go on.
further, like what you see on the physical book, right? The collection of symbols, there's so much more there than just the ink that's put onto the paper. In the same way that looking at a person, there's so much more there than what you see, on the outside. So even when you like push it to that level, right? A book is more than a book in a sense of what's written inside of it or the ideas that are expressed from it or the ideas that are inspired by it. And so you'd use
Yeah.
that
What's
same
what's
logic or
important
apply that
about
same
if you have a
principle where
book
it's
sitting on a
like,
table, what's the most important reality ascribed to that book? The fact that it is made out of paper products, that it's made out of ink, that it's made out of glue and binding yarn and stuff like that. Like no, what's important about a book, the important reality about a book is the ideas that it contains, the story that it contains, right? Nobody
mm,
thinks the value of a book is the paper that it's made out of, right? So what's true about a book is what it conveys, what it communicates. And the makeup of the book, the physical construction of the book, that's just accidental, right? To use some good old fashioned scholastic
mhm.
language. And
You could even say, like, to some degree, now maybe not entirely, but like in one sense, it could convey the same idea over different languages. Now, the trouble there is that languages might be more tailored to one idea
mhm,
or another. So a book written in its original language, might be able to convey the idea better than a book that's been translated to a different language that maybe struggles with certain
sure,
ideas more
sure.
than others. But there again, um, you could even push it that far and say that you're starting to get into, some would argue, the more essential qualities of it, and yet there's still even more behind it. There's still even another
Sure.
facet.
Fun fact before we move on from this little discourse on symbolism. The antonym, the antithesis of symbol is in Greek. Do you know this one?
Hit me with it.
Diabolos. So there's symbolos,
Oh, the
and it's
to bring
and that is
together.
to bring two things together. And just to put a little bit of emphasis on that, that is not to represent something with something that it is not. That is to bring two things together, right? So just to
Yeah.
reinforce what we were just saying, the word symbol means both things are present, like they are brought together at that juncture, right? So we're really talking about real stuff here, phenomenologically speaking, I suppose. But anyway, then
You
Diabolos,
could say it brings together it brings together the metaphorical and the literal in the symbol
yeah,
itself.
um,
But anyway, sorry. Yeah, your
yeah, the antithesis of
antithesis,
Diabolos, which
the
obviously
scatterer.
that's just the devil, right? Diablo. But yeah, so Diabolos, when we refer to Satan as Diabolos, the devil, we are talking about the fact that he tears things apart, that he is breaking things down, right? Um, which is a pretty good word for the type of work that Satan is doing, I think, in the world around us today, right? And he's always been doing it, but I mean, it just feels pretty real to me. I'll just say that.
Well, and again, going back to some of the stories that we
Sure.
wanted to talk about, I can think of powerful moments in both the Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, where the the evil of this evil force, whether it's Voldemort in Harry Potter or Sauron or just the um, Saruman or whatever, is their ability to break up the Fellowship or to break up the good guys, break up the Order of the Phoenix. And so this dividing
Hmm.
force is very much equated with whatever the big evil thing is. Um, and going back to our thing about binding, so again, it's not a question of if one is going to be bound, it's what are you going to be bound to? And so we were talking before about the Plato's Republic example or the Ring of Gyges, where it's not that he was
Yep.
unbound. He may no longer have been bound to, the societal norm or society's laws, but that just made him a more deeply bound to his
Exactly.
passions. And it's almost like is that the better alternative? In the same way that we may be more unbound from these societal conventions, these societal conventions, but it doesn't mean we're unbound. It just means we're binding ourselves to something maybe a little bit more
Well,
nefarious.
so one of the things that's really, really important within the Christian tradition is this idea that we are community first and foremost, right? And I think that across time that gets broken down, and now we're at this point largely because, and don't be wrong, I am a fairly patriotic guy. I love American history. I love the story of America. But one of the things that America has brought to fruition is this what I would call like radical individualism, right? And the story of
Mhm.
Yagi's ring is basically just a story of radical individualism, right? What we have
Yeah.
nowadays is one, and that's kind of breaking apart because you see a lot of movements now where you're seeing a lot of collectivism coming back into people's conversations, things like that.
Well, that's the thing is like we can't exist in that
Yeah,
vacuum, and so we
like
will eventually,
I
right,
would
bind
say
ourselves to
that the
something
20th century
afterwards.
brought the American people to a place of radical individualism. Like the second half of the 20th century was all about radical individualism in a way that it just wouldn't have been. It just wouldn't have been in the minds of people from the first half of the 20th century. Though the seeds were there and they were growing, I would say that they were planted all the way at the founding,
Mhm.
frankly, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that has the seeds of this kind of radical individualism in it, right? And the entire American story kind of has that in there. But anyway, it comes to fruition in the second half of the 20th century. And now we're in the aftermath of that, which is why we have this thing called postmodernity. And which is why uh, there's a lot of ironies and conflicts in all this, but on the one hand, you have a sense that everyone has their own truth, and that's a product of radical individualism. But because of that, you also, like you were kind of implying, you get people needing to glue together again. And they're gluing together around
Mhm.
identities. Like we prioritize personal identity, and then somehow that turned into group identity, right? And now we have kind of group politics, right?
This kind of actually carries over from our last conversation on the Matrix of the whole, like, being plugged
Mhm.
in sort of thing.
Well,
It's very much this, like, well, I feel too alone by being isolated from whatever everybody else is, even if it's this fake, quote unquote, "fake thing" of
well,
the
and
Matrix.
you know what I want to
And
say is
so
that, like, obviously group identities have always been around, right? I'm not saying that's like a new product or whatever. I'm just saying that you have this weird thing where I do think there's a difference between a kind of tribalism that occurs within nature, as opposed to, and that would have been just like family units coming together, forming tribes, and there's this kind of like organic tribalism happening, right? And that's kind of the foundation of society as such, right? That's like the polis that like Aristotle would have talked about. But what happens in the history of politics basically is you, at least American politics, is you broke down the tribe to the individual, right? So there is no tribe anymore. And now you're reconstructing tribes along ideologies. instead of like just like living communities. And I think there's a difference there between what people are binding themselves to. Again, this does kind of go back to the whole Matrix conversation, because the what's binding people together now is like basically, stuff they talk about over the internet, right? And that's not the same thing
Well,
as
so
going to
this
your
actually,
grocer and like buying food from him and having him over on Sunday or something like that.
so I was saying how like this idea of the ring and binding, it doesn't just have this mythological, it doesn't just have this theological use, but it has psychological, and like I said, in the classical sense of the word of the psyche or the soul, it has this connection to our soul and our identity. And so, going back to our Harry Potter example of Horcruxes, where those come from, or what the context of those in the story is that this wizard will, or at least the main bad guy wizard, he wants to live forever, right? It's his main motivation is to conquer death, to have immortality, which already from a Christian standpoint, you can see some sort of like parallels. But in order to do that, at least in this distorted way, he's committing these acts of dark magic is all they really talk about. But they do imply that murder is
Hmm.
included in these actions to
I'm
make
almost
a
positive
Horcrux. And what it
it
does,
actually is essential. Yeah, like he
that's
actually
like the
has to murder
action.
somebody in order to instigate it.
Yeah. And what happens is that it takes and again, a part of your soul, if you want to say metaphorically speaking or whatever, I know the metaphysics aren't quite there, but takes a part of a soul and puts it in some object, which is part of the ceremony. And so that person has now bound him or herself to that object, so that if you are killed in some other context later, that piece of your soul is still there and you can come back. So you're getting this pseudo immortality through these actions of dark magic and, sort of a soul for a soul sort of thing, right? Because they always
Well,
involve
so let
murder.
me for the record, I'm a really pretty big Harry Potter fan. Like I'm not one of those like Harry Potter fanboys. Like I don't go to conventions or whatever. But I was reading those books. So the first couple years, I avoided the books because I thought they were just like kid stuff. But then, like around like 15 or something like that, 14 or 15, um, I actually got sick. I was in bed for like a week, and I was like, okay, everyone just loves this Harry Potter stuff. I'll check it out. And then I was hooked once I started reading them. But
Oh yeah.
I am of the age, and I feel very special when I say this. I do. I feel very special. Um, that I was the same age as Harry. I was literally the same age, and so every
Oh, okay.
single year, she would basically put out a new novel every year, and every year that he aged up, I was an age older. I was his age as well, right? And so I graduated high school. Like the final book came out the year after I graduated high school. So there was a little bit of a time lapse there. But I more or less grew up with Harry Potter as he was growing up too. And let me tell you something, as someone who was one of those people, and there's only so many of us because you can only be born as when you're born, folks. That was special. That was fun, and it was great to I know, it's very
Aw,
heartwarming. And so I'll
yeah.
always have a very soft spot for the Harry Potter series because of just, like, my nostalgia for that period of my life and, like, what that was like to read them as I was growing up. That being said, though, Harry Potter is this fundamentally religious work. And I know that J.K. Rowling is not inherently, like, the most, like, conservative, traditionalist Christian. I believe that she does identify as a Christian. And I think she intentionally was not shying away from elements of her Christian worldview when she was writing.
Every other mythological aspect of her stories is too intentional for you to start seeing like the Christian things as
No, yeah,
accidental, you
it's
know?
it's
Yeah.
very Christian in its themes. Um,
And these are recognized, I think, predominantly by a lot of Catholic theological writers and Orthodox theological writers. One of the main, I think he's the Hogwarts professor, is one of the main blogs that I remember started coming across. And he, I think, is it John Granger is his name, but he is an
no kidding.
Orthodox Christian. And so I think the reason why you'll see this so prominently. And yes, there are certainly, just like there are tons of, non-Catholic, non-Orthodox Christians who are into Harry Potter and some who condemn Harry Potter. You'll see Catholic and Orthodox Christians who condemn it as well. But where you see the deepest symbolic resonance is in these Catholic and Orthodox or liturgical Christians, right? Ancient liturgical Christians, because we have this symbolism so ingrained in the theology. And so you see it more than just on the level of Harry dies and Jesus dies for his friends. Harry dies for his
Spoiler alert,
friends, so
bro.
Harry's like Jesus.
Whoa, dude.
Yeah.
But
remember when you were talking about how old you were? The books have been around for a
That's
while.
true.
And more importantly,
here's
the
what I'll
movies.
say is and then one of these days we're gonna we'll have an episode just about magic as such, right? And then we'll get into like Harry Potter magic and things like that. But when it comes to these Horcruxes,
all right, fine.
All right, no, I'm not going there. Anyway, but the Horcruxes as such though it's really like this sacramental like motif, right? So
like anti-sacramental, though,
we'll call it anti-sacramental because I don't want to imply that it's from God, right? Like I don't want to. So fair enough. So you could say, yeah, like, but here's what I mean by that is that a Horcrux is basically operates like a sacrament does, in the sense that what is happening is an object is being infused with the union of the person to that kind of like material means.
And how is it brought about?
Well, through sacrifice. Yeah, absolutely.
Through
Yeah.
sacrifice. Yeah, exactly. So it's like it's very much,
No, you're right.
Sorry,
No,
I didn't mean to
exactly.
keep going.
Like so it's basically you just take the idea of what sacraments are in Christianity, and that's literally what Horcruxes are. Is they're basically just I mean in the sense this is Voldemort and it's an evil, like you said, Mike. It's like an evil sacrament, I suppose, because what's happening is he's destroying his soul. He's breaking his soul down so that it could arbitrarily live on its own, and it's this weird division thing, and so that's true, right? Like it's all diabolical in that regard, but like literally diabolical in that regard.
Yeah, I
See,
know.
now that you know that diabolos means that, it's like, oh, okay, I get it. But at the same time, it's this idea that the material world around us is infused with genuine spiritual reality, right? And there are some material
Mhm.
means that God has given us that are designs to be ways of engaging with God's grace in the material world, right? God could have made a purely spiritual plane of existence. I mean, like he did in the sense that there is a spiritual plane of existence, but he didn't need to make matter, right? When God decides to create creation, and he has these layers to it, this invisible reality that we call the spirit realm and the material world, right? That's not arbitrary. Like none of that. God doesn't. There's this Gnostic heresy that the material is not spiritual, that the material is, whatever, just this encasement for the spirit or something like that.
Or that it's opposed to.
Yeah, but God creates
Yeah.
everything and he creates it good, right? He declares it good. And he chooses he chooses the material world to be made. Like he wants the material world to be made. And then he wants to unite himself to the material world. And he incarnates, right? But so the sacraments are just it's the fusion, it is the nexus of the spirit and the material in a I don't like a unique way or way that is so designed by God. um and so Horcruxes kind of they symbolize this idea that there's a nexus between the material and the spiritual. um
Well, and it's of course fitting that one of those is a ring. Now, the ring in the context of the story has significance to the character, to the main bad guy character, in terms of his family, which I do think they talk about at some point in the series where you're supposed to choose items that already have significance to you, which kind of goes to your point of the spiritual having a connection to the physical, or in this case, you could say like the emotional having a connection
yeah,
to
we
the
don't need
physical.
to
So
yeah,
you're
we don't
already
need to
supposed to.
they don't need there's no the emotional and the spiritual and the psychological. These are all just words for like different facets of one reality, and that reality is you, right? Like there's you, and you have these
So,
facets, but
but one of them, I think, fittingly, is a ring, and it also, I mean, this, get ready, Jacob. It's not in the outline, but
it's
I
my
think it's
job.
also really significant that if you remember the role that the ring Horcrux has in the Harry Potter when it comes to Dumbledore, I think that's also pretty significant too in terms of binding,
So
right?
you're not
And
afraid to
obviously
tell
in
people
terms
that
of
Harry
like
Potter dies, but you're afraid to go into the details of what the ring means to Dumbledore? I mean, go ahead, Mike.
well, I just mean in terms of setting up Dumbledore's
Yeah.
fate for
Is that the bigger
Half-Blood Prince,
spoiler?
where
We
he
all knew Harry
basically
Potter was gonna die, so we
yeah,
can just go ahead and talk about that?
yeah, he was a lamb led to the slaughter, I think. But no, but anyway, it's basically Dumbledore almost tries to like take it into his own
Mhm,
hands. Literally, he's wearing it, and when he tries to destroy it, and that's what does, in a very indirect way, does
mhm.
lead to his death, right? And so that I think is really just a really cool kind of detail or reflection you could kind of take from, again, Rowling could have chosen any of the other Horcruxes to have this role, but it was the ring. It was the
Yeah,
one, again, that symbolizes this binding that has that. So in terms of like binding
yep.
fates, that definitely plays a powerful role there too.
Um,
What about the rings of power?
yeah, I know, we've got an entire episode about rings, and we've basically mentioned Lord of the Rings, like, in passing.
It's, you know what? It's just because we've been so like burned to it that it's like we can't talk about it. But yeah, we finally will talk about Lord of the Rings.
So Lord of the Rings is everything we just talked about. Obviously, it's everything we just said is baked into the idea of why Sauron he puts himself. It's again like basically J.K. Rowling just stole Tolkien's motif of Sauron putting his soul
A lot of people
into the
assumed,
ring.
yeah, a lot of people assumed that she was more influenced by C.S. Lewis because she had 7 books, like he had
Mm,
7 Narnia books. But she talked about how she was more influenced by Tolkien, in terms of the world building, in terms of the, not. She's actually not trying to make things as
uh-huh.
directly allegorical. Like the stories themselves resemble
Well,
Tolkien
I
much
think
more
that
than they
people
actually
the
resemble
reason why
Lewis.
people are so drawn to all the big fandoms, right? And I'll even say this like prior because even DC and Marvel, like the comic book kind of worlds, um, I guess in some ways they always had a really, really dedicated fan base. But I guess there's these examples of fandom that like kind of explode overnight, right? Whereas I think comic book fandoms,
Yeah.
they kind of you kind of grow up with them. They feel less like they came out of nowhere, to my mind. But Star Wars, it happens and suddenly it's an explosion of people loving it. Harry Potter, explosion. And to some extent, Lord of the Rings, right? Lord of the Rings was when it was finally really catching on in the 60s and 70s, kind of exploded. It's because of the world building, right? I think what those Star Wars, Harry Potter, and Lord of the Rings have in common is that you feel these very immersive worlds that the creators have, fabricated.
And it's what's given them that lasting presence, which, to go back to your point about like liquid modernity and how it feels like something becomes antiquated in 5 minutes. And yet, because of the level of detail in world building, you can always go back to those places. You don't have to
Hmm.
reinvent those places or
Yep,
those
yep.
characters,
And you
you
want to
know?
go back there and you want to play in that sandbox and all that stuff. But yeah, but so anyway, she basically like Sauron, like the rings of power, they're just Horcruxes, right? But they're like in that case, you have good ones, right? Like so, like the 3 Elven rings and stuff like that, specifically.
Mhm.
Well, those are good sacramental rings, you know. And I do think here's the thing, and this is probably hey, take this with a grain of salt, folks. I don't want this to sound wrong or incorrect theologically, and I could be totally wrong here. But at least from my Orthodox perspective and the way that I understand sacraments, because Orthodox, I do think there's a slight distinction between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, whereas Catholicism has kind of like a greater specificity as to what qualifies as a sacrament. In Orthodoxy, we're a little, per our want, we're a little looser in how we define sacramental stuff.
It'd probably be more like capital S sacraments versus lowercase s sacraments. But like I said, we don't know if we want to. Yeah, there's something to be said about what you're kind of describing in the Catholic world, because one of the other things you'll hear about is how the church is called a sacrament, but that doesn't mean that the church says that there are 8 sacraments. It's just more looking at the, like, kind of in the same way that Catholic is used as a proper noun, but also as a common noun
Mm,
for universal. So that's kind of what, so like the Catholic world or the Catholic Church has an understanding of sacrament more akin to what you're describing, but and yet there are also these specific 7,
yeah.
that again we would share with the Orthodox too, though. That's the thing too.
Yeah, Orthodox, yeah, and I think that, and frankly, I do think that this was like due to Catholic influence, though. But Orthodoxy has adopted this idea.
You're
I don't
welcome.
know if it was an improvement, but anyway, like, but there's what I'm getting at is that sacrament is basically, if you define sacrament as a means of grace, then clearly pretty much all of reality is a means of grace for the Christian, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, and this is something I'll steal out of one of my favorite podcasts that I always name drop on here, the Lord of Spirits podcast, where they actually they coined this term, demonosis. So theosis being,
Mm.
the transformation of ourselves into God, into, being deified, being, um, it's basically what we're born to be is in the image and likeness of God, right? To be deified like Him, to be like Christ, to transform into creatures like Christ. Um, but you can do the opposite of that. And so there's this demonosis. There's this idea that you can transform yourself into a demon. You can transform yourself into a satanic figure kind of thing. And I think that like something like a Horcrux is basically like a demonic sacrament, right? But the
Mhm.
mechanism is fundamentally the same in the sense that it is using the material world around
Well, that's the
you.
thing. It's a demonic
Yeah,
parody,
it
right?
is using the
Demonic
world
parody,
around
sort of.
you for evil instead of for good, right? And so in Lord of the Rings, you have some rings that are made, specifically the ones made by the elves, that are imbued with the grace of the Valar, right? Like they're angelic rings, and then obviously the one ring that Sauron, forges, is basically a Horcrux, right? It's literally just a Horcrux. Um,
Mhm.
that's demonic. It's for evil, it's for destruction, it's for power, um, and all that stuff. So,
Well, and what's interesting, so even in the phrase, right, "In the darkness bind
mhm.
them." So you have the word binding, being applied very directly. The fact that they have this spiritual power to any of the wearers, even though, right, in one sense, you're overpowering the ring, but in a much deeper sense, it's overpowering
Oh, for
you.
sure.
Right. And so that's always the big danger when, whenever anybody ever offers, oh, well, we'll just wear it to beat these bad guys. Yeah. Well, you're doing that. It's actually overpowering you without you realizing. But most importantly, it's binding you to
Mhm.
that one ring. Because if you think of the nine that
Yep,
were given to men, they were using theirs, and it's what bound them and what eventually turned them into the ring
absolutely. Yeah.
wraiths.
No, it's a
Right.
real, and it
And
makes them
what's
invisible. Alright, so, like, let's
oh,
go
go
back to
ahead.
the invisibility thing, right? Because what's happening is you're becoming less real, right? To use a very Lewisian, like a Lewis C.S. Lewis type motif here.
Mhm.
You're losing your material presence in the world. It's you're becoming less than you were when you become invisible, right? You're becoming a wraith, like literally, right? And so
Mhm. And think of Frodo,
absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
It's when Frodo puts it on that he's actually in more danger, because when he gets stabbed
Mhm.
wearing it, that's when the deeper
Well,
wound
and
occurs, the
it's
wound that
one
may
thing
never
to
heal.
carry the ring, right? It's another thing to participate with the ring by wearing it. When
Mhm.
you are, and it's funny because, even in that story, like, I'm bound to the ring is bound to me, right? There's a sense of, like, being fated to the ring kinda thing, which is
Yeah.
If we have time. I don't know if we will or not, but we should get to Green Lantern at some point because I could say all kinds of stuff about Green Lantern.
Well, it's funny you bring that up, Jacob, because actually that's kind of will bring us into part 2 of this conversation, which, we spent a lot of time. I know. Isn't it more fun to just be surprised when so
yeah, my faux surprise. I think the cat's out of the bag. I already talked about Green Lantern at the beginning of this episode. But
so we're actually gonna we did a lot of time doing the like kind of historical or mythological background, but we haven't really gotten into comic books as much for this one. But Green Lantern, as you know, is very much centered around the idea of rings. But not only that, we're going to talk about how what it has to do with binding, and what it has to do with power and the will. Right, which you can, again, if you're familiar with the character, familiar with the comics, you can see very much how this is going to parallel. What do you think? Can you make some time for that, Jacob?
Yeah, anything for one of my faves.
Is that me or Green Lantern? Can you be more specific?
Definitely Green Lantern. Though, however, if you have a magic ring that allows you to project your imagination into reality, then you too can be my favorite.
Mine is the magenta one. Mine's the passion one.
Yeah, you would be the pink one too. The nice little pink tutu to go with.
Oh yeah, you had to go there, didn't you? Like, of all the places you could have gone, that's the direction you.
Hey,
if we,
I'm low.
Yeah,
I'm petty like that.
Yeah,
I'm very juvenile like that.
We just had a conversation about how we wanted to make our podcast different, and here you go, just picking the low hanging fruit.
If you were a TikTok video, you would have those little pink wire lights behind you because you're basic.
Ooh.
Hey, but I tell you what, Mike, if you had a power ring, maybe you could manifest a better ending to Game of Thrones.
Ooh, nice. Yeah. If you want to hear, if you want to join us for more, see, he just when we get into the stuff that Jacob chooses and Jacob likes, he just thinks he can be like say whatever he wants. So if you want to join us for our next conversation, where we're actually going to get a lot more into the Green Lantern, but kind of stick with our theme of rings, religion, and binding, join us for next episode of the Voyage Podcast, where we're going to go through all that stuff again. Don't forget to like, subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, so that Jacob can have an excuse to keep insulting me every week. We'll see you guys later.
And get some context for all the different colorful commentary, no pun intended, that I just gave on Green Lanterns.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.